let me introduce myself. I'm a few hours short of sleep, so I'll try and make sentences. What this mainly is to do with work that I've done with, as a freelancer with my company, and also other work that I found interesting and inspirational, and I suppose aesthetically and ideologically sort of similar. I've tried to arrange everything to address boundaries. Some of them I may have squeezed a bit, but that's been my aim in the choice of things that I'm showing. So if you bear that in mind. I think the idea is I'll talk a bit and then you can ask questions. If you want to ask questions on the way through, please do. If there's I don't think there'll be anything will not be clear, but if you want anything during, please feel free. I think Chris is going to pay attention. Just very quickly, my background, just to put a little bit of context in, I shouldn't be here because I was born in 1945, and you know what that means for people of my age. I think we're going to be in lockdown for the next 4 months, according to the ITV. But anyway, I'll start that when I get back tomorrow night. So I was born in 45. My father was in the Navy, so we used to move a lot. My early schooling, I went to several convents. So Navy and convents has, in some way, I think people would agree that know me, has been reflected in the sort of work that I do. I would never have a straight line if I would never not have a straight line if I could have one. And then I went to drama school, and when I left drama school, I worked with an American company called Mama and various other experimental companies, which I will talk about. Now, boundary, I mean, I think we've talked about boundary being the line that marks the area, but looking a bit more at pushing the boundaries in an attempt to expand it by doing something no one had done before or been able to do before. I think that's what I'm looking at a bit in the sort of things that I'm showing you. This was a company I performed with before I formed, this would have been in the sort of early 70s. Interaction, the group was called TOC. This was a show called The Pit. This had a particular relationship with the audience that, if you see there were 32 audience. The wall was in 3 parts, and you can see the audience would look through those slits. It was, of its time, that show, it was a sort of master-slave, and as we opened ourselves up, so the sections of the wall came down, until finally, so one section would come down, and then the next section would down, until all the sections of the wall were down, and then we brought the audience on stage and did stuff with them. That was quite an unusual piece at the time. Then, in 1973, I formed Lumiere and Son with a writer called David Gale, and he was a Cambridge boy, and he went to film school. I came from theatre. And our tastes and aesthetics, as everybody does when they form a company, develops. I mean, we didn't at the beginning see what our tastes were, but they did evolve. And one of our first shows was a show that we did Rainbow for a group called Henry Cow, and for some reason we didn't. Although our shows were, I think, theatrical, we didn't really like props. So it was quite a large number of years before we realised that rather than humping railway sleepers around, you could have one made of polystyrene and act. But originally, and so here we did stuff with sheep's heads, proper sheep's head that were a bit stinky, but which we presented to each other, and I think that they were slightly shocking for people at the time. But there didn't seem to be the question of, I mean, we needn't have them at all, of course, but there didn't seem to be a question of doing prop heads at that point. We had a very good, I think our graphics were quite good. this was done, there's a guy called Storm Thorgerson who used to work with a company called Hypnosis, who used to do record covers for the Pink Floyd and Peter Gabriel, and he was on our board and he would design, those are his, and he'd often try out stuff because this was all pre-Photoshop, so he had a record cover when there was like hundreds of hospital beds on a beach, and so he had hundreds of hospital beds on a beach, and but what we found was that well, there's two other ones a bit later on. Our press was terrible. We're looking, this is sort of in the mid-70s, and the thing about it was that, to be honest, we were lucky to get press at all, because we were all London-based. I thought everybody was, but of course they're not. We used to perform at the Oval House, which was south of the river, and reviewers would rarely go, and if they did go, they would be very begrudging, and as you can see, not generous in any way at all. Now this is one, Michael Coveney, who's still around, he's just written a book on amateur theatre. He, we got that, there's a huge long review about a Sanu Wilson play, and then a little paragraph at the end said this was preceded by some dusty nonsense, piffle of course. But when we got that, we wrote to him, put, "Dear Coveney, fuck you." And I saw him, I was on a panel with him, and he said that he thought he had it coming, which of course he did. But that sort of thing was definitely what they could get away with. The thing about press thinking they were shit, and the sort of venues who had no marketing department, and we'd have audiences sometimes of 8 or 9, sometimes 11, and so it was a fantastic time to just develop ideas, because unlike today, where how many people come to see you, audience surveys, you're really very much at the mercy of opinion, either press. But in those days, not at all. And it was Liberty Hall. These are some of the people. You may know some of these. I heard that he died. I don't know if you know these names. I mean, he used to do stuff with piss, Cozy fan tutti, with piss and tampons, and he was delightfully offensive. And then Orlan, actually I've got pictures in here. Orlan, I don't know if you know her, this is up here, she used to have cosmetic surgery. Those are cheek implants that she had implanted in her forehead, and people could watch the surgery taking place. The Kipper kids, I don't know. Have you heard of it? Have you heard of the Kipper kids? They used to beat fuck out of each other but they were really very what's the word? Abandoned. Stellark. Now these are all quite challenging. And they were inspirational, not so much because the content of what they did, but the outrageousness of it and the exploratory nature of it. And it was a sort of encouraging time to do things because you were in that sort of company. The Natural Theatre, they were always rascals. And the People Show also. Here's a bunch more that I don't have illustrations of, but those, Cantor, all those people, more recently Castellucci, I don't know if any of you have come across him. They're mostly indoor people, else comedians. They were wild people throwing, they were very dangerous, with their pyrotechnics that they'd hurl at the crowd. I'm sure it's better that you can't do all that stuff now, but it was quite thrilling at the time. Castellucci, he's still operating in. I mean, a lot of these have developed into more. I mean, at Page and Jan Fabre, they do opera and big, large-scale stuff. And of course, films and literature, always an endless source of inspiration. So this street theatre, which you all know about, and I think that those are elements, and I think the thing about offending and frightening people, one knows that you're not actually going to do them real damage, but it is a platform. I mean, I'm obviously I'm a completely different generation to people producing work now, but the idea of not offending, I mean, I work with quite a lot of young people and they say they don't want to offend, and I wonder why they don't want to offend. I mean, I don't think you should offend by being personal, but certainly you can offend by introducing ideas that are unpalatable. This was an early show that we did with Lumiere and Sons, Special Forces. We had a couple of versions of it. This was an early version that was at the Bath Arts Workshop in the 70s. And what they did, I mean, people who know Bath, at that time, there were quite a lot of liberal young mothers, because we asked if we could have some babies that we could carry through the street, and people quite willingly gave over their babies. So, so there were babies. The ones that didn't have babies had fire extinguishers. But we then went on to do it as an indoor show, and in order to choreograph it, I worked with an American GI who did. We were all very fit, and we were very well. Most of you are, but we were very fit, and we did this. He did lots of GI manoeuvre stuff, and then we got somebody else in to do acrobatics, and I choreographed it using boots and the GI marching into English country dance shapes, and that worked quite well. Now we've talked a bit about Sultan's Elephant, just in terms. This is going back to the idea of, I suppose, presenting the familiar in a different way. These sort of things. These are illustrations of street stuff that did this. I don't know if any of you saw this, but it was so huge, is that when that elephant, I think if you saw the elephant in a field, it wouldn't be so impressive. But if you were standing and you knew it was coming around the corner, you'd be looking sort of here, but in actual fact, it was up there. And the skill of manipulation of that girl. And Artichoke had a marriage. Just what perseverance and certainly charm and inevitably money allowed her to do, because lots of things you think, well, I can't go there because there's traffic lights in the way. But they don't have to be in the way, you just dig the buggers up and then you put them back in afterwards. And La Machine, that's the offshoot of Royal Deluxe. This was at Liverpool. And it also transforms it from the numbers of people, the idea of street art being, public art being free. Now, certainly most of the stuff that I've done hasn't been free, even when it's out. I mean, street theatre has, but site-specific outdoor, which I'll come to. But the thousands, the hundreds of thousands that come, and the delight of it, and the fact they come across something they don't know about. And I think that is, I know some of you have been mentioning this in some of the sessions, and I think that's a key. And if you can astonish people, surprise them, astonish. I think this was astonishing, even for the likes of me who rarely get astonished, I think. Anyway, one of the shows that we did, Circus Lumiere, this was one of our more popular shows. We did it in quite luxurious situations. We did it as a residency at Wimbledon School of Art. It would have been in the about 1980, somewhere around there. And we had 4 designers that each had a budget of about £500. I think this is 1980, so it's a long time ago. £500 would buy quite a lot. And we got a fee, and they were given to us to do the design. And we had a tent built. The tent was designed by, I think, architecture students in Bristol. And I mean, it's a silly tent, beautiful but silly, because it just took us it's 6 poles, it took us such a long time to put up. And when you look at the modern big top, you know, but it was, you know, we did all the what's at work. The way it, I set up this with the cast, it's 1 woman, a ring mistress, and 5 men. I set them homework so that they had to, on Monday, to come up to a presentation on Friday. And the idea was that they would get a sort of well-known music hall or circus act, but it would have a twist at the end. And they came up with some very good ideas. This one on the right-hand side is a mind reader who, he has plants, which I'll talk about a bit in a minute, in the audience, and then eventually he eats his brains and he loses his facilities. This one here was, there was a rabbit, and he'd come on to Spanish music, he'd carry a case, and he'd lay out some implements and hatchets and things. Then he'd get a rabbit out and he'd put it all around the ring. Then he'd put it down, chop off his head, and then get out a top hat. So, you know, just... it surprised me when people said, was the rabbit dead before we did it, because I don't think they'd swallow. Now this was, we used to get plants, and they used to get the plants just like 10 minutes before the show, because they'd get them from the audience. And this was a conjurer, and he does a bunch of stuff with eggs, and he says to the plant, take up the knife, and you expect to open the eggs, but in fact he says, and take up the knife and kill me. And there was this long knife, it was a proper knife, and the plant would go like this, and it would stick out of his body, and he'd go straight back. And one night, because I used to see all the shows, he was doing a bit of this, and I thought, oh, that's not very good. And in fact, what had happened was that the plant that he'd got was a very reluctant plant. He didn't want to do it, but he said, oh, please do it, because we start in a couple of minutes. So he did it. And the chap, instead of doing straight, he did this. So he missed the shield, and it plunged into his spleen, which he was. Spleen's not that important, apparently, but I think so this was and these were some lovely costumes that they made. So I mean, I think the thing about that show was, I mean, I don't know if many of you work with plants. They're a tricky business, because you clearly want them to be as believable as possible. And I think that we sort of found, by getting them so late on, they just had to do what they were asked to do. But the next year we did it. I have to say, responsibly, he had a larger thing and a retractable knife, so it couldn't happen again. Yeah. Just something to go back a bit. When we started our company, it was 1973, we started it with some money from a member of the Pink Floyd, and that meant that we paid wages right from the beginning, and then we got an Arts Council grant, not a big one, but so we always sort of managed to pay people. But in those days, interestingly, I mean, there were community companies that worked with the community for ideological reasons, probably the way that most of you work with, access is a big thing. But we worked with members or non-professionals, I think we call them, or students. And the Arts Council in those days, we had to do a certain number of productions a year. If we worked with members of the community or non-professionals, that wasn't considered part of our output. That shifted clearly within a decade. But it was interesting then that there was no value given to working not with professionals.
Now there's no value given to working as professionals.
Say again?
Now there's no value given. Now you feel
you have to.
You have to do.
Yeah. I mean,
that's what justifies you being a professional.
And so this was 1995. Our company lost funding at the beginning of 90. I think we were funded for about 20 years, then we lost it. It was easy to lose because they didn't have to, in the old days, they'd have to give you notice of planning to stop your revenue funding, but then you used to get 3-year funding, sort of on the understanding that they could just cut you off without much explanation, which they did. This was a show that was done, I don't know if any of you remember this. The Arts Council had this fund called New Collaborations, so that people would collaborate with people that they would never normally collaborate with. I mean, not just fellow artists, but there were some quite wacky collaborations. Some of them worked. This was done in Galston, near Great Yarmouth, and 3 of us came together, a video maker, a composer, and me. And it was a tricky collaboration because we were all used to making our own work, and I was used to being a director, but it wasn't really. I eventually, after 3 years, became the director, but it was quite tricky, the collaboration. There was a TV program made of it, and certainly one of them said that they would never dream of working with me again. And I'm not with them, actually, but socially we got on really well. We liked each other, we talked a lot about stuff, but the working relationship was very tricky. And this was compounded by the fact that the Arts Development Officer, who effectively was producing it, hadn't been there long and had huge enthusiasm about what a project such as this would do, how much people would want to participate in it. That, I think she just thought we'd be absolutely spoiled for choice about people. And I wrote a scenario that one of the reviewers said his 8-year-old son could have written a better one. Well, he didn't, that's what it is. But it involved people walking, going around the harbour, and they had a yacht pond. Let me show you it. And opposite the yacht pond, you could have this, which we did have, you could have this grandstand. And there are lots of clubs, lots of yacht clubs, model yacht clubs. And so I came up with the idea of having this model yacht regatta. But what I hadn't realised, nobody had realised, that if yacht club A came along and yacht club B was there, yacht club A would scalp her. So all these groups that we thought we were going to get all of, we only got one of, because none of them would work together. And that happened quite a lot with other participants, is that they weren't just one sort of mass of locals or waiting to be engaged in this project. And so it was a huge canvas, and the harbour was closed, and I got a tank. We were meant to have 2 tanks. We were meant to have 3 helicopters. We only got 1. We were meant to be filling the harbour, and we just had 1 boat. So, unto themselves, they were good. But when you were meant to have multiples of them, And there was a marketing department that was saying this show is going to be bigger than James Bond, and people promising stuff that it was, I wouldn't say it was a disaster, but it was a much, you're looking out at sea, and you're expecting your vision to be filled up with a whole line of boats that are going to explode, and you've only got the one. It's just a small, it's a small picture. Plus the fact that it was the end of September and everybody was freezing. All the press came up from London and stayed in the same hotel, and they absolutely slagged it off. I lost another job because of the reviews. It wasn't that bad, the show. It was okay. But what it was good for, and what none of the press took into account at all, was what happened after it. The groups that had come together performed it, to perform in it, stayed together and continued to produce stuff. Lots of different, so the legacy of it was actually very positive. But because it wasn't set up, or if the previews or the press releases suggested that, it certainly wasn't taken to heart when people were actually reviewing it or talking about it. It was...
no one measured their smiles.
Say again?
No one measured their smiles.
No. It was... I mean, they were terrific, Everybody was terrific. But I think this is... It is a problem with legacy, isn't it? In terms of you come and you do something, people have a great time. What do they do when you leave? I mean, that's a major source of consideration now, isn't it? I mean, I don't know how it's measured. I don't know if it's measured locally after you leave, is it?
Short term. Really short term.
So
the evaluation is really short term. The evaluation is really short term, not long term.
Yeah. Well, there we are. Other things, I know Punch Drunk came up. I've seen lots of their shows. I think that, I'm sure other people have done this, everybody's done everything before, but I was quite impressed by the wearing. Has anybody seen them?
Yeah.
When you're a member of the audience, you're given the mask. So what it is, I mean, they do meticulous design, and they usually have a narrative that you can follow, or you don't have to. You go in batches of 25, or the first one, the Faust, and then you're let free, and you can go in and out of any of the rooms. But you're wearing this mask, so that when you look around, and I think the person in the cloak is one of the ushers. So when you look around, you don't, although the audience are around you, and you're around them, they form a much more coherent image of what you're actually generally looking at. It. So you don't have that separation of audience and performer. What they were very good at, on the 2 or 3 I've seen, 3 or 4 I've seen, is you can roam freely. Some people follow the narrative, you can room to the other. You're free to look and see what they've put in the drawers and everything, but they managed to herd you quite well for the finale, which I think they're rather good at. As indeed are the Secret Cinema, who are a similar sort of thing, but they do it with films. I won't talk about that. Another very impressive chap is Dries Verhoeven. Are you familiar with him? He's done a bunch of good stuff. This was something I saw in Utrecht, and I know we've been talking a bit about the alienating nature of headphones, or you go in individually, you say which language you speak, and you go, this was I saw it at a transport museum in Utrecht, and there's this transport hall, and in the circle there's on the seats there's a suitcase, and on the top of it there's a mobile phone. So you pick up the mobile phone, and you have this, well, I had the silkiest voice talking to me, and you pick up the suitcase, and they say, where would you like to go? And I said, I think I'd like to go to the Arctic. And so they talk you around, they tell you where to go, they ask you questions, and I haven't got a picture of it, but at one point you see people in the distance with a suitcase and a phone, and on one of the platforms there was a signal man's box with an old-fashioned typewriter. There's nobody in the vicinity, and you've got this voice saying, write down your very first memory. And I said, my Uncle Fred taking me to the convent. And then I go off. And it seems like this is a typewriter, remember? Seconds later, tell me about Uncle Fred. And so it's all this, and then you go in and you have a whiskey and stuff, and then just while this is, I mean, I think the interesting thing about the telephone for that is that when you sort of think how many personal calls you have, well, you know, I mean, I could really understand telephone sex talking. I mean, it wasn't lewd in any way. It wasn't remotely suggestive, but it was just the tone of intimacy, it was very impressive. Just when it opens, I'll show you. While they're doing it, I'll tell you what it is. Then I'll show you the picture. Anyway, you're walking around, stuff happens, you put on a record, and you know, and then finally they say, and now you're going to the Arctic, and so you go, and there's this double bed, and you've got a key on your suitcase, and you unlock it, and you've got your own pillow, and you lie on the bed, and you're looking up. If that's where the station is, you've got people pulling you back and you're on the bed looking up, and the person that's been speaking to you waves to you. And it's all those dreams where you dream you're in a bed and things happen. What's happened to Dries Verhoeven is done, he's worth looking up. I mean, it depends if you look people up. I mean, I look people up, I love looking at other people's work. I mean, I know that some people don't because they don't have their imagination sort of muddied by other ideas, but I think it works in the opposite way, really. The more you get in, the more you can sort of synthesize it into something that do you know NVA?
Yeah.
A company in Scotland. They do landscape stuff. Not anymore, they don't exist anymore. But I did a few shows with them in various areas of responsibility. And that was quite interesting because one of the first ones we did was, what was it? Called The Secret Sign. And you got this gorge. Oh, has it come back? But one of the things about NDA's stuff that they do in the landscape is that, you know, they animate huge areas. They're big, you know, lights and. But because people are actually going on a long walk, I think they have a sense. I mean, this isn't to underplay it because I think what he did was excellent. But I think the fact that you have walked up in the Highlands, you have gone on a 3-mile walk, you have a different commitment to. You sort of feel it without even seeing anything, let alone the lights and monks and stuff like that. And I think that's the thing that I think is happening more and more, is that people are after experience. I mean, you could say that street theatre gives an experience all the time, but in a way, things like the Dries Verhoeven and Punch Drunk, I think, you know, the fact that people go in and I suppose it's immersive, isn't it, that they participate in, they sort of feel that they've invested much more. And that wasn't the case, I think, probably a decade earlier.
Boot it up.
Do you have any questions or any comments so far? Is it
Just a really banal question. Why have you called Lizzie errors?
just play on the word sonic in the air? Really?
Oh, it was bed.
Oh, there we are.
I
There
think
we
we're
go.
there.
Right. So if we go back a bit.
So that's where we were.
Yeah, so if we go on. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's the bed.
Oh, wow.
So you're lying there looking up, and you've got people pulling you.
Like the low tech.
And it's I mean, we were talking about this. It's an individual experience. I mean, it's what Alan's talking about. You know, a lot of the digital or the VR. It's an independent experience, and I think it is true that you do lose that sense of community. But sometimes that's great to have a personal experience that many people can have them, but they have them on a personal basis. This is the one of the landscape. It's a landscape one. This was the other one, the secret sign. It's going up a gorge, and the night before the show started, there was a flash flood. So, for safety reasons, this structure, the scaffolding, and everybody wore waist, what you wear when you go fishing, boots. And up there were a mixture of stuffed owls and real. So you look up and you see these stuffed birds, and then you walk past, and then there would be another one moving, and that was quite good. But it's just that element, those little touches of surprise that you blasted. You're not going to go any further. No. Les Swan, Cumulus. I don't know if you know them. I've never seen them, but I've come across them, and people have talked about them. If Alan, please correct me if I'm wrong on this. As I understand, these were purported to be, and the sign said this, that they were the last humanoid tribe in Central Europe, and they were brought down to be put on display in various squares in France. So this is what they looked like. They had guards, and they took them out on they had never. I feel as if I've seen them because I've looked at the pictures that come up, but I haven't seen them. So this is the explanation, and I suppose that I've mentioned this before with a heading theatre. How is reality? Is it or isn't it? Now, if people think this is real and it isn't real, does that create a dilemma because quite a lot of work over the years is predicated on not really knowing if it's real or not real. Does it make it more effective? Is it? I mean, I know some people think it's deceitful, but truth is not always that theatrical, is it? It's sort of you want a bit of and another one that I talk about, which I actually won't talk about now because the time is getting on. There we go. Now these are shows that I've done, and I'll just whack through them because Deadwood was this. Oh golly, this is how it started. We did it in the middle, I think 1985. It was a commission from the Waterman's Arts Centre in London, and they asked me if I'd like to do a show, and I said I would, but I didn't really want to do another theatre show. And so we did something in Kew Gardens. It was just across the river from them. And our administrator, Adrian Evans, had just come back from South America, and the destruction of the rainforest was being written about a lot in the newspapers. I mean, people who knew about these things already knew it, of course, but and so my concept was to do 24 hours in the life of a rainforest. And the audience, we did it on 4 nights between 1,500 and 2,000. 2,000 was top wackaroo. I think we were meant to only have 1,500, but it was extraordinarily popular. And the form, it was parameters. They walked around and on 5 different locations, and the 102, that was it. I have to say, however, that only the musicians were paid. All the other actors, the sweethearts, did it for sandwiches. And we got a lot of them. And this was, so this is the sort of look of it. Parrots, I think that's a sloth. Now, one of the things I mentioned, one of the reasons I'm mentioning this one is that it was pre-health and safety awareness. These were the people that were leading them. There's Trevor, for those that know him, a younger man there. So, for example, these two were up the tree is bottoms down here. I mean, they were allowed to shimmy up the tree and not be harnessed. Now, I'm not saying that's good, but it meant that we had enormously long cable runs that were just in the grass that now you'd have to bury or put on a... So it was possible to do things that you can't do now. This was a huge show, and we did it for very little money because we got an enormous amount of sponsorship. We had, I think, in the budget £3,000 for lighting, and it was a large area. And there was a company, I think it was Samuelson's, who had just lit the film The Mission, which was about the rainforest, and they gave us probably about £80,000 or £90,000 worth of lighting, because of, we put in a good, we got it. And I think when you do something unusual, because this sort of work wasn't done that much then. I mean, it's very popular now. That's fungi. That was done. We did it again in Singapore. Now, the thing about this, I mean, I think it was a good show. Undoubtedly, it was a good show, and I was pleased with it. But the thing about it was that the audience loved going to the Kew Gardens out of hours and seeing it in a way that they hadn't seen it before. And I mean, they were just beginning to computerise the box office, and I think people phoned up and said, "Oh, you don't have," because we probably performed at Waterman's a 200-seat or something, got about 50 people or whatever. And I think some of the box office said, "Oh, you don't need to book." And of course, it got sold out. It had ever such a lot of coverage because it was unusual and because it was in Kew Gardens, and the audience liked being there. When we did it in Singapore, it was a very different experience because we worked with members of local community groups. Well, they weren't performers exactly, but they were community centres. We worked with 4 or 5, and the audience were surprisingly greedy, and I thought because it's so hot there, the show would be much longer. What would happen? You'd be sort of here. We used dusk for dawn. So you'd be here, and light would come up over there. And in London, people would just sort of stroll looking up like this, But in Singapore, as soon as something came up over there, they'd all hair up there. So we knocked 45 minutes off a show that was only... And what they did, some of the audience of bastards, is they'd go up to these young men and women who'd never performed before, who were completely inhabiting their gorilla or their sloth, and they said, "Who are you supposed to be? Who are you supposed to be?" And none of them broke character. They were terrific. But the press complained, that why did this festival have these sort of people in a show? So it's funny, really. You would have thought that it would have been appreciated, but not so. And then we did something, war dance. This was a similar thing. It was done at Nottingham Castle. A mixture of professional and non-professional. The soldiers were as Trevor on a horse. And there again, people liked being in that place, looking at performance that they would normally only go at during the day. Now, I'll talk a bit more about this one. Dining with Alice was a commission by the Salisbury Festival in 1999. I was asked, if I would do something on Alice in Wonderland. And I said, well, I don't really do adaptations, but Alice, it was the 100th anniversary of Lewis Carroll, and Alice Liddell lived not far from, this was the Llama Tree garden, a Victorian garden. So I came up with a thought, with the idea of what happened to the characters of Alice's imagination when they were no longer needed for her dreams, that they'd run soirees at the Llama Tree Gardens. And so this was the starting point. That was the concept. The audience were 256 diners. It's simple maths, but Lewis Carroll liked mathematical riddles. And that was the form, and that was the cast. Now, there were meant to be 256 volunteers, because the idea was that each of the diners would have their very own waiter or attendant, but despite promises of sandwiches and free transport, we only got 64, or maybe a bit more than that. So this was the recce, a lovely little place. Now this they had this here. Now this is a very, if you're doing something in a garden and it's got something like that that's really quite particular, it seems that you had to use it. So, and because it was an old Victorian stage sort of thing, it seemed that one had to use it. I had to use it very much for a concert of some sort. So the idea was that the audience came, they were given a cocktail or something, they were greeted by their by the characters, who started having an argument about, do people get what they deserve? Because I think a boy had lost the Red Queen's music, or the one who says off with their head, and the Red Queen, is it the Queen or Queen of Hearts, whatever, said off with his head, and the Mad Hatter said, I think that's a bit stern, isn't it? So the whole evening was given over to these characters discussing whether people got what they deserve. And what I had was 256 dining tables laid for 8. And the gong went, and the waiter came and took the diners, and the first course people dined on their own. So you were sitting at a table laid for 8, and you're expecting 7 other people to join you, but in fact you were just on your own. And then you were visited by a character. If you were only one, you just visited by one character who would generally be preoccupied with the notion of whether people got what they deserve. And then the second course, you would go and you would join another person, another stranger. And then the third course, you would be reunited with the people you came with. When we did it in Salisbury, it was a small place. When we did the recreation, people complained. The box office told them they were going to be separated. People complained about being split up with the people they came with. So what they did, the bastards, is that, if one was at one table, they'd see where their friend was, and they'd take a chair and their food with them. And this was the finale on the thing. And I had 64 tables, red, white, so it looked like a chessboard. And a lot of the waiters were choir. And then when we recreated it, the main thing, this was for the Norfolk Festival, and Norwich and Norfolk, yeah. And we did it in this country house, which belonged to a friend of the producer, Helen Marriage, and it was not open to the public. So, and it's a long, thin plate, thin site. I don't know if you ever heard of Bombers and Par, but this is the dining table. What we did with the table was that the hire of crockery and cutlery was very, very expensive. So what our designer did is she drew table mats with the knives and forks on, and we only put proper knives and forks on the places that people were actually going to sit at. This is a side transport. And we had to build a little village. That's me at the end. We had to build a little village, production village, because they had nothing. They had nothing there. But the problem was that we didn't have a theatre. We didn't have a stage. So what my designer came up with the idea of building this, of building this pontoon so that we'd use the house as a backdrop, but there was no where to put the audience. So we had this pontoon and floated it around the moat, and then the audience. No, not that. So then the audience went there. But interesting, the second time we did it, I thought, I'm going to show these bastards. They're not going to if they're going to be separated. So one person, if you came with somebody, you'd be at that end of the garden, and your friend would be right up the other end. And you would go, so you couldn't do that together. High control here, none of this dirty stuff. But afterwards, when they were, for the third course, when they were reunited with the people they came with, some people were disappointed because they loved dining with somebody. They hadn't dined with strangers for years. So give yourself the chance, and that was good. Now the producers said, how can we sell VIP tickets? What can we do to add value for the, let's say the tickets were 50 quid, including a slap-up dinner, I hasten to add. How can we charge more? They said, can they have umbrellas? No. Can they have special food? No. So what we ended up with, which I think we ended up, poor old characters had to stay around at night having photographs taken. And that was what they got. I think they got an extra cocktail and a photo opportunity. We had Alice's from different sizes. Each something goes small, each something go big. They would scamper around the place. The Mad Hatch there, yeah. And that's the final scene. I'll walk through this. I was asked to create a parade for the Golden Jubilee, and this was 2002. So I did 50 years of the cultural, social, and political life of Britain. And so that's nannies over the period. I try to get nanny. That's Ralph. Nanny Ralph. So these are this is food in the 50s, how food to sort of, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s.
Where was that? Where?
Wow.
The Mall.
Did somebody speak?
Kim asked where was it?
Oh, in the Mall.
In the Mall,
yeah. In the Mall. And these were some of the characters. It's the Mall, it's not the mall. What I also had is I had 5 floats of each decade showing how Britain went from a mono to a multicultural society, and on each float. So this was the 50s, so they had jive. They had jiving, and I had in the background is the sports float. That's toys. And you see Muffin the Mule, but none of you know about Muffin the Mule. But the thing about this was Muffin the Mule came to my garden because he's this big. On each of the floats, I had an oversized thing. So this is sports. We have Dolly the sheep, and also on each of them we have musicals. That's the art float. I think that's Les Miserables. So there's the various, what's his name? Gilbert and George at the front. And now this is something that there's three key things I want to say about this. Was that this was 2002, and there were phone boxes. There were loads of there were fantastic researchers working with me on this, so much detail. And the music was, so if a phone box that rang a 50s ring was here, the sound would come out of there. When it comes out of here, it comes out of there. Now, what this depended on, because it didn't have the technology that there is today, it was reliant on the lorry drivers driving at 4 miles an hour. And to do that, I had a walker in front of each of the lorries, making sure that they kept to time. But the fucking lorry drivers, they were so overwhelmed by the numbers of people, they were leaning out the window and waving so they got out of sync. We managed to bring it back, but now this is the last one was a celebrity float, and they all those figures were sort of key celebrities. There were 50, and these are sort of Barbara Windsor and people, awful people, the worst people. But anyway, they were. But we had Princess Diana, and so this is 2002. I can't remember when she died, but it wasn't that long before. And there was a great, because we used to go to the palace every now and again. There was a great worry that what it was doing. The Queen was there, the floats were coming, and they were doing that, and then they were going back to Horse Guards Parade. And there was a fear that the Queen and the family would be upset by seeing Princess Diana. So the truck went back to the workshop, and everything was moved around. And then, bugger me, at the last minute, they changed the direction. They changed the direction that it went around, so it went this way, so that way. So that was, and I think it didn't make any difference. It didn't make any difference at all. I think the Queen went through it. But an enormous amount of work went into this, and it was essentially 20 minutes. So if you sort of think, they'd go past you at this sort of pace, and there was so much detail on. Never would I do it. I know I wouldn't have the opportunity, but we should have parked up for people to actually see, to look at it as if it was a sort of museum or whatever, because so much work had gone into it just to sort of pass by, and it's so I think so that's the audience at the end. Coming on to. So after that, I was approached to say, would I like to work at Disney? I knew nothing about Disney. I don't have children. I think I'd seen Bambi. I'd never been to Disneyland. I went out for the afternoon, looked around, and I met the man that was to become my boss. I had my portfolio for website days, and I was there for an hour, and I think for the first 45 minutes, he was telling me all about himself. And then because I asked questions, and I thought, well, gosh, don't ask another question, Westlake. Just wait for him to ask. He didn't say anything. I said, would you be interested at all in finding out about me? So he was looking through my portfolio, and you take out, you put in the stuff that's pertinent or relevant. But unfortunately, I left a picture in from a show that I did right at the beginning of a young woman sucking a breast of another young woman. And he sort of picked through, he centered on that. And those were the only questions he asked me. So I thought, I think this isn't the job for me. He's not going to be interested. But a month later, I was shortlisted, and I went out and I was interviewed by 5 people, and I knew they were going to give it to me. And I think it's that thing, I wasn't really interested in it, but it was a number of projects had fallen through, not because of any virus, but so I was free. And we did The Lion King when we were there, and I didn't like the job, but there were bits of it that were terrific. When I first went there, I was sent to the States to look at development of some of the technology that goes into their rides, and very impressive. I mean, they've got I don't know if probably none of you have ever been there, but some very impressive stuff. It's just the general ethos and what it's all about that's the problem. But, you know, I used to like the overnight technicals because you're in a space of which you've got total control, whereas mostly if you do work outside, if you do technicals outside, you're really restricted. I stayed less than 3 years, but I like being in Paris. It was good. When I came back, I worked with Alan. Used to be slime. This is, I think the brief was that the thing was to try and work with circus artists who wanted to incorporate. Did they want to, or did you want them to? You know, to
I just made them.
What?
I just made them.
Yes, to incorporate their skills into something theatrical. It sort of worked, I think, didn't it? I mean, I had to do 6 shows that stand on their own, and a few more lines. I think they were good, actually. Let's say they were very good. But it is quite difficult. I think it is a very tricky thing for circus artists that have a particular act or a skill. I mean, that if you go up the West End, or if you go to some musicals, particularly, or operas, you know, you find that some directors will incorporate circus skills. I mean, Phelan McDermott did a Philip Glass, or something, and he got a juggling troupe, the name of which I can't remember. They did. Was it? Yeah. They did fantastic thing, and he also got the chorus to sort of throw a ball. I mean, that was quite to sing and just do. I mean, they only had to do this, and you could see some of them were not really letting them go from their hand. But that's sort of, you know, that was a bit of incorporation. And there's far more interdisciplinary work that goes on in the mainstream now. But I think when you're trying to, when you're trying to perfect an act, I think it's a tricky thing when you have to put it in another form. I mean, some people, do you come across this? I mean, is this something that you come across, that people have got a particular skill that they want to put somewhere else? Is it? I think that's the end. Yes, it is. Yeah. Just to finish up, a couple of the sessions that have been here. I don't do many productions. I do mentoring, a bit of mentoring, a bit of this sort of stuff. But what I spend quite a lot of time is I'm part of a collective called Artists for Palestine UK, and we do a lot of campaigning. But something that I've found over the years, I mean, a lot of the work that I've done, I would say is broadly political in style and where it's performed. But I've had, throughout my life, a problem doing what would be, I suppose, described as political theatre, because one doesn't want it to be too heavy-handed. I mean, do you know Jeremy Hardy, dead now, of course, but, you know, if you look at how he, very strong politically, but he had a great way of using humour, marrying politics and humour. And I think, you know, you look at some theatre, and we were talking about this today, strong images that really you can make a very strong impression. But I found it difficult, so although I've been politically active all of my adult life, and I've been asked to do things. You know, I remember when Thatcher came in to do something about Thatcher, my mind went completely blank. I couldn't think of a thing, and I usually come up with something because you don't want to be too obvious. But I think now there is, I mean, you know, not only taken from today, but there is a much more politicisation, I think, of performance. There is a much greater willingness to have issue-based content, and how effective it is clearly depends on how well it's, you know, the imagination behind it and how striking the images or the text or whatever it is. But it is, I mean, I think it is quite a tricky thing, because one's got an intellect for something and you can't marry it with something else. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Well, thank you so much. There's
just fantastic to get a little insight into your work, your processes. Especially, and I'm so pleased you could be here with us and share
Well, it's
that.
been very enjoyable. I'm sorry it's so late, but you know.
Sorry to you, it's so late.
Yeah, sorry. Apologies for it's stretched on a bit later than we wanted.
Oh, well.
But there we go. Yeah.
Time passes anyway, doesn't it? It's just what you fill it with.
I was really particularly interested to see the pictures of the surf show because I've heard so many stories about that from so many people. It's like a really notorious show, and I've never seen any imagery from it, so it was really
It's a good show
lovely.
that's time at 12,
Yeah.
I think it was
Yeah. So, if it's okay, we've just got time for just a couple of questions.
Sure.
So I don't want to put it
I
too. Liz.
Do you see your responsibility as more to yourself and the vision of the work or the audience?
Well, it's interesting you ask that because I would say that the audience was barely a consideration. You wanted them to come and you wanted even if they didn't like it, it didn't particularly matter, really. So I mean, clearly work that I've done, say, in the last decade, you've got to take into account. But I don't do enough work now. I think whatever I would think, my responsibility would need to take in very much the concerns of the audience. But previously, it's trying to get the bloody ideas out, really. Because, I mean, everything that I think I've ever been involved with, one's working against the odds. You've got this much and you're trying to get that much out of it. So that's really where it's all been, I like to think people like working with me, but nobody they can say. But, so I want the performers to have a good time, and things like that Norfolk show, I was very keen that all the participants, enjoyed what they were doing and understood what they were doing. So I certainly feel responsible towards them. But I suppose there's that thing that if you think you're doing something interesting, and arrogance, I know it's arrogance, but that people will find it interesting. But I don't think I could have that attitude these days. I think it wouldn't be possible. I think it wouldn't be, because there'd be so many other considerations that would go into somebody agreeing. I mean, I can think of even proposals in the last decade, the questions that surround it. But, one feels vulnerable about being challenged on the ideas, but often people don't bother about the ideas. They think, well, you take care of that. They ask for everything else, from toilets to, And I don't mind that. I certainly don't. I like being questioned about it, but it's not my...
Thank you very much.